The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in August 1882, and it shattered Laura Sinclair's world into pieces so small she wondered if they could ever be reassembled. Her husband Thomas had been killed in a cave-in at the Silver Ridge mine, his body crushed beneath tons of rock and earth, while searching for the veins of silver that had made men like Charles Hartford rich beyond measure. The words on that thin paper were clinical and cold, offering no comfort to the young widow who stood on the porch of her modest home in Pecos, Texas, her hands trembling as she read them again and again, hoping the message would change. She was 23 years old, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes the color of storm clouds. Thomas had been 26 when he died, strong and optimistic, always believing that one more day in the mines would bring them closer to the life they had dreamed about. They had been married for 3 years, and while they had little money, they had possessed something more valuable in love and hope. Now, Laura had neither the money nor the hope, and the love existed only as an ache in her chest that threatened to consume her entirely. The mine company sent a representative 2 days later, a thin man with a waxed mustache who arrived at her door with papers and an expression of practiced sympathy. He explained that, while the company regretted the loss of her husband, the compensation fund was limited, and according to company policy, widows were not entitled to the same benefits as other family members. His words made no sense to Laura, who stood in her doorway with her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold the pieces of her life together through sheer will. "What do you mean I am not entitled?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas worked for that mine for 2 years. He gave everything to that company." The representative shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to deviate from his script. "Mrs. Sinclair, the policy is quite clear. Compensation goes to the primary wage earner's parents or male heirs. Since you have no children and your husband's parents are deceased, there is no one eligible to receive payment." Laura felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I am his wife. I am his widow. How can you say there is no one eligible when I am standing right here?" "I understand your distress, madam, but women are not recognized as dependents under the mine's compensation structure. Mr. Hartford himself reviewed your case and made the determination." The man tipped his hat and turned to leave, and Laura stood frozen on her porch, watching him climb into his buggy and drive away down the dusty street. She spent that night sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills that had accumulated over the past months. Thomas had been injured once before, a broken arm that had kept him out of work for 6 weeks, and they had fallen behind on everything. The rent on their small house was overdue, and the general store had extended credit as far as it could. Without compensation from the mine, Laura had no idea how she would survive. She could take in laundry or sewing, but those jobs paid pennies, and she would never earn enough to cover what Thomas had brought home. The next morning, she dressed in her best black dress, pinned her hair up beneath a simple bonnet, and walked the 1.5 miles to the Silver Ridge mine office. The building stood at the edge of town, a whitewashed structure that looked too clean and proper to be associated with the dangerous work that happened deep underground. Laura climbed the steps and pushed through the door, ignoring the startled look from the clerk who sat behind a desk piled high with ledgers and papers. "I need to speak with Mr. Hartford," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, shook his head. "Mr. Hartford does not see visitors without an appointment, madam. If you would like to leave a message, I can ensure he receives it." "I will wait," Laura said, settling herself onto a hard wooden bench against the wall. "I will wait as long as necessary." She sat there for 3 hours while the clerk worked and occasionally glanced at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Other men came and went, miners and foremen and businessmen, all of them giving her curious looks but saying nothing. Finally, the door to the inner office opened, and Charles Hartford himself emerged, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than Thomas had earned in a year. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his tone suggesting he had been informed of her presence. "I am terribly sorry about your husband. He was a good worker." Laura stood, squaring her shoulders. "If he was such a good worker, then why will you not honor his death with proper compensation? Why am I being told that I do not matter simply because I am a woman?" Hartford's expression hardened. "Mrs. Sinclair, I understand you are grieving, but business policies exist for good reasons. We cannot set precedents that would bankrupt the company. Every miner knows the risks when he signs on." "Thomas knew the risks," Laura said, her voice rising. "He accepted them because he trusted that if something happened, his family would be taken care of. I am his family, Mr. Hartford. I am all the family he had, and you are leaving me with nothing. I am sorry, but my decision stands. Good day, Mrs. Sinclair." Hartford turned and walked back into his office, closing the door firmly behind him. Laura stood in that reception area, her hands clenched into fists, feeling rage and desperation warring inside her chest. The clerk would not meet her eyes, and she finally turned and walked out into the bright Texas sunshine, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She did not notice the man watching her from across the street. He stood in the shade of the Mercantile's awning, a tall figure in worn denim and a dusty hat, his eyes following her as she walked back toward town with her shoulders slumped in defeat. His name was Pierce Abbott, and he had been working as a ranch hand at the Double T spread just outside Pecos for the past 6 months. He was 28 years old, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of weathered bronze. He had seen Laura around town before, always with her husband, the two of them walking together with the easy comfort of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. He had noticed her not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of the way she smiled as if she carried sunlight inside her. Pierce had come to Texas from Colorado after a series of misfortunes had left him rootless and searching for a fresh start. He worked hard, kept to himself, and saved most of his wages with no clear plan for what he would do with them. He had heard about the cave-in at the Silver Ridge mine, heard about the men who had died, and felt the familiar weight of sympathy that came from knowing too much about loss. His own father had died in a mining accident when Pierce was 15, and he remembered his mother's struggle to keep their family fed and housed in those dark months that followed. Now, watching Laura walk away from the mine office with defeat written in every line of her body, Pierce felt something shift inside him. He thought about his mother, about how no one had stood up for her when the mine company in Colorado had done essentially the same thing. He thought about justice and fairness, and all the ways the world ground down people who had no power to fight back. And then he made a decision that would change the course of his life. He crossed the street and followed Laura at a respectful distance, watching as she turned down Main Street toward the residential area where the miners and laborers lived. He did not want to frighten her, but he needed to speak with her, to offer whatever help he could. When she reached a small white house with a sagging porch, she climbed the steps and sat down on an old rocking chair, burying her face in her hands. Pierce stopped at the edge of her property, removing his hat. "Mrs. Sinclair," Laura's head jerked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She looked at him with confusion and wariness. "Yes, my name is Pierce Abbott, madam. I am sorry to intrude on your grief, but I overheard what happened at the mine office. I wanted to tell you that what they are doing is not right, and I would like to help if you will let me." Laura stood slowly, studying him. She saw a man with an honest face and tired eyes, someone who looked like he had done hard work his entire life. "I do not know you, Mr. Abbott. Why would you want to help me?" Pierce stepped closer but remained at the base of the porch steps. "My father died in a mine when I was a boy. The company did the same thing to my mother that Hartford is doing to you. No one stood up for her, and she worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep us fed. I swore that if I ever had the chance to help someone in that situation, I would. So here I am, madam. I cannot promise I can change Hartford's mind, but I can promise I will try." Laura sank back into the rocking chair, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I do not have money to pay you, Mr. Abbott. I have nothing." "I am not asking for payment," Pierce said quietly. "I am asking if you will let me try to get you what you are owed." She looked at him for a long moment, this stranger who had appeared in her darkest hour offering hope when she had none left. Finally, she nodded. "What do you suggest?" Pierce put his hat back on and glanced toward the center of town. "First, I need to understand exactly what happened to your husband and what the mine's policies actually say. Then I need to figure out who in this town might have influence with Hartford. Is there a lawyer in Pecos?" "There is Mr. Donovan, but he works for the mine," Laura said. "There is also Mr. Patterson, but I heard he mostly handles property disputes and wills." "Patterson sounds like a place to start," Pierce said. "Would you be willing to meet me at his office tomorrow morning? I want you there when I talk to him so he understands this is about a real person, not just an abstract case." Laura wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me." Pierce was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because it is the right thing to do, Mrs. Sinclair. And because I have learned that the world has enough people willing to look the other way when injustice happens. I would rather be someone who at least tries to push back." The next morning, Laura met Pierce outside of Patterson's law office, a small building sandwiched between the bank and the telegraph office. She had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. When Pierce arrived, he was wearing cleaner clothes than the day before, his hair combed back, and his expression determined. Together they climbed the steps and entered the office. Garrett Patterson was a man in his early 40s with graying temples and spectacles perched on his nose. He listened as Pierce explained the situation, occasionally glancing at Laura with sympathy. When Pierce finished, Patterson leaned back in his chair and sighed. "What the mine is doing is not illegal," he said carefully. "Company policies are within their rights to establish, and unfortunately, women are often excluded from compensation structures. It is not fair, but it is legal." "So there is nothing we can do?" Laura asked, her voice breaking. Patterson held up a hand. "I did not say that. Legal and right are not always the same thing. If you want to challenge this, we would need to build a case based on precedent or public pressure. There have been cases in other territories where widows have successfully fought for compensation, though none that I know of in Texas. The other option is to appeal to Hartford's sense of decency or to his concern about his reputation." Pierce leaned forward. "What if we could get the other miners to support Mrs. Sinclair? If they threatened to strike unless the policy was changed, would that give Hartford reason to reconsider?" Patterson raised his eyebrows. "That would certainly get his attention, though organizing miners is dangerous business. Men have been blacklisted or worse for trying to unionize." "I am not talking about a union," Pierce said. "I am talking about decent men standing up for a widow who deserves better. Surely some of those miners worked alongside Thomas Sinclair and know what kind of man he was." Laura looked at Pierce with something like hope flickering in her eyes. "You think they would do that?" Most of them have families to feed. They cannot risk losing their jobs. Maybe not all of them, Pierce admitted, but maybe enough to make a difference. Patterson pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. If you are going to pursue this route, you will need to be strategic. Talk to the miners quietly, away from company property. Find the ones who are well respected and have some seniority, and be prepared for Hartford to fight back. Men like him do not take kindly to being challenged, especially not by someone they consider powerless. Over the next week, Pierce spent his evenings after work visiting the homes of miners and their families. He introduced himself, explained what had happened to Laura, and asked if they would be willing to support her claim. Some men shut their doors in his face, afraid of repercussions. Others listened, but said they could not afford to take the risk. But a surprising number, especially those who had known Thomas personally, agreed that what Hartford was doing was wrong and they would stand with Laura if it came to that. During those same days, Laura began to notice Pierce in ways she had not expected. He was patient and gentle when he spoke with her, never making her feel like a burden or a charity case. He brought her groceries one evening, claiming he had bought too much and did not want them to go to waste, though she suspected he had purchased them specifically for her. He fixed the broken step on her porch without being asked and refused any attempt at payment. And when she broke down crying one afternoon, overwhelmed by grief and uncertainty, he simply sat with her on that porch and let her cry without trying to fix it or tell her everything would be all right. "I feel so lost," she admitted when the tears finally subsided. "Thomas and I had plans. We were going to save enough to buy a little piece of land, maybe raise some cattle. Now all of that is gone, and I do not even know who I am without him." Pierce looked out at the dusty street, his expression thoughtful. "You are Laura Sinclair, and you are stronger than you realize. I have watched you this past week, and you have not given up even though you have every reason to. That takes courage." "I do not feel courageous," Laura said. "I feel terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear," Pierce replied. "It is doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid." She studied his profile, noticing the way the evening light caught the angles of his face. "You speak from experience." "I have been afraid plenty of times in my life," Pierce admitted. "After my father died, I was scared we would end up on the street. When I left Colorado, I was scared I would never find a place where I fit. Fear is just part of living, I suppose." "Do you fit here in Pecos?" Laura asked. Pierce turned to look at her, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "I am starting to think I might." By the end of the second week, Pierce had gathered support from nearly 40 miners, enough to make a significant impact on the mine's operations if they decided to stop working. He met with them as a group one evening in the back room of the saloon, a gathering that had to be kept secret from the mine's foremen and managers. The men listened as Pierce laid out the situation and explained what they were asking Hartford to do. "This is not just about Mrs. Sinclair," Pierce told them. "This is about establishing a precedent that says workers' families matter, that widows deserve to be taken care of when their husbands die in service to the company. If we let Hartford get away with this, what message does that send? That your wives and children are expendable, that your lives are worth less than the silver you dig out of the ground." A miner named Jacob, a burly man with a thick beard, spoke up. "What if he fires us all? Some of us cannot afford to lose our jobs, Abbott." "I understand that," Pierce said. "But what I am proposing is not a strike. We are simply going to Hartford as a group and asking him to reconsider his decision. We are giving him a chance to do the right thing before any action is taken. If he refuses, then we can decide together what the next step should be." The men murmured among themselves, debating and discussing. Finally, Jacob stood. I worked with Thomas Sinclair for 2 years. He was a good man and a hard worker. His widow deserves better than what she is getting. I am in." One by one, the other miners voiced their support. Pierce felt a surge of gratitude and determination. This was not just about legal battles or company policies anymore. This was about a community coming together to support one of their own. The following Monday morning, Pierce and 40 miners walked together to the Silver Ridge mine office. Laura stood on the porch of her house watching them pass, her hand pressed to her chest. Pierce had asked her not to come, not wanting her to be present if things turned ugly, but she had insisted on at least being nearby. Patterson, the lawyer, had also come, carrying a leather case filled with documents and precedents he had researched. Charles Hartford was not pleased when he looked out his office window and saw the crowd of miners gathered outside. He came out onto the porch with 2 of his foremen flanking him, his expression cold and imperious. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "You men should be at work." Pierce stepped forward. "Mr. Hartford, we are here to respectfully request that you reconsider your decision regarding compensation for Mrs. Laura Sinclair. Her husband died working for this mine, and she deserves to be taken care of." Hartford's eyes narrowed. "I already explained to Mrs. Sinclair that company policy is clear. This matter is closed." "Company policy can be changed," Pierce said, "especially when that policy is unjust." "Who are you to tell me what is just?" Hartford snapped. "You do not even work for my mine. You are a ranch hand sticking your nose where it does not belong." "I am someone who believes widows should not be left destitute when their husbands die," Pierce replied, his voice steady. "And I am speaking for these men behind me, many of whom knew and respected Thomas Sinclair." Jacob stepped forward to stand beside Pierce. "Mr. Hartford, we are not here to cause trouble. We are asking you to do the decent thing. Mrs. Sinclair is one of us. She is part of this community. If you cannot take care of her, then what faith can any of us have that you would take care of our families if something happened to us?" Hartford looked out at the sea of faces, recognizing men who had worked for him for years. Some were his best miners, men he could not easily replace. He saw the determination in their eyes and understood that this was not going to go away quietly. "I will consider the matter," he said finally, his tone clipped, "but I make no promises. Now get back to work before I dock your pay." The miners dispersed slowly, some of them clapping Pierce on the shoulder as they passed. Pierce remained standing in front of the office, looking up at Hartford. "We will be waiting to hear your decision, sir," Pierce said, "and we hope you make the right one." Laura was waiting for Pierce when he walked back through town. She had moved from her porch to the edge of the street, unable to stay away. When she saw him approaching, she hurried toward him, her skirts kicking up dust. "What happened?" she asked breathlessly. "He said he would consider it," Pierce replied. "It is not a yes, but it is not a no either." Laura felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of hope rather than despair. "I cannot believe you did that. I cannot believe those men stood with you." "They stood with you," Pierce corrected gently. "They know you deserve better." She looked up at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. "Why are you so good to me, Pierce?" He reached out hesitantly and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Because you deserve goodness, Laura. You deserve every good thing." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Finally, Laura stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "Would you like to come inside for coffee?" she asked. "It is the least I can do to thank you." Pierce followed her into the small house, ducking his head slightly to clear the doorframe. The interior was neat and sparse, furnished with pieces that looked worn but well cared for. Photographs of Laura and Thomas sat on a shelf, and Pierce found himself looking at them, seeing the happiness in their faces. "You had something special," he said quietly as Laura busied herself with the coffee pot. "We did," Laura agreed, her back to him. "Thomas was my best friend. We grew up in the same town in Missouri, knew each other since we were children. When he asked me to marry him and come to Texas, I did not hesitate. Do you regret it?" "No," Laura said, turning to face him. "I regret that he is gone, but I do not regret the time we had together. Those 3 years were the best of my life." Pierce sat down at the small kitchen table, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. "He was lucky to have you." "I think I was the lucky one," Laura said, sitting across from him. "Thomas saw the best in everyone. He believed in second chances and hard work, and the idea that things would get better. I suppose that is why he stayed in the mine even when it was dangerous. He believed it would pay off eventually." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee. Pierce found himself wanting to know everything about Laura, not just her grief but her hopes and dreams and the parts of her that were uniquely hers. He wanted to hear her laugh, to see that sunlight smile he had noticed before tragedy had stolen it away. "What will you do if Hartford does not change his mind?" he asked finally. Laura set her cup down carefully. "I have been thinking about that. There is a woman in town, Mrs. Henderson, who runs a boarding house. She has been looking for help. The pay would not be much, but it would come with a room and meals. I could manage, I think, even without the compensation." "You should not have to just manage," Pierce said, a hint of anger creeping into his voice. "You should be able to grieve your husband without worrying about where your next meal is coming from." "The world does not always work the way it should," Laura said softly. "I am learning that." Pierce reached across the table and took her hand before he could think better of it. Her skin was warm against his palm, and he felt her fingers curl slightly around his. "I am going to make sure you get what you are owed," he promised. "And if Hartford still refuses, then we will find another way. You are not alone in this, Laura." She looked down at their joined hands, feeling something stir in her chest that she had not expected to feel ever again. It was too soon, far too soon, but she could not deny the way her heart seemed to beat a little faster when Pierce was near, the way his presence made the world seem less overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." 3 days later, a messenger arrived at Laura's house with a summons to meet with Charles Hartford. Laura's hand shook as she read the note, unsure whether this was good news or bad. She sent word to Pierce at the Double T Ranch, and he rode into town immediately, meeting her outside the mine office. "Whatever he says, we face it together," Pierce told her as they climbed the steps. Inside, Hartford sat behind a massive oak desk, his expression unreadable. Patterson the lawyer was also present, standing against the wall with his arms crossed. Hartford gestured for Laura and Pierce to sit in the chairs across from him. "Mrs. Sinclair," Hartford began, his tone formal. "After considerable thought and consultation with my advisors, I have decided to make an exception to company policy in your case. You will receive a one-time payment of $500 as compensation for your husband's death." Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. $500 was more money than she had ever seen at once, enough to cover her debts and keep her housed and fed for at least a year if she was careful. "However," Hartford continued, his eyes hard, "this payment comes with conditions. You must sign a document stating that you will make no further claims against the mine, now or in the future. You must also agree not to discuss the terms of this settlement with anyone outside this room. If you violate these conditions, you will be required to return the full amount plus interest." Pierce felt anger surge through him. Hartford was buying Laura's silence, making sure this did not set a precedent that other widows could use. But before he could speak, Laura stood. "I accept your conditions, Mr. Hartford," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And I want to thank you for reconsidering your position. $500 will make a tremendous difference in my life." Hartford looked surprised, clearly having expected more resistance. He pushed the document across the desk, and Laura signed it without hesitation. Patterson witnessed the signature, and then Hartford counted out $500 in bills, stacking them neatly before sliding them toward Laura. "This matter is now closed," Hartford said. "Good day, Mrs. Sinclair." Outside, Pierce turned to Laura with confusion and frustration written on his face. "Why did you agree so easily? He was trying to silence you." Laura clutched the money to her chest, her eyes bright. "Because I do not need to talk about this settlement to help other people. Mr. Patterson has already started researching compensation laws, and the miners know what happened here. Hartford thinks he won, but all he did was prove that pressure works. The next widow who faces this will have a better chance because of what we did." Pierce stared at her, seeing not just a grieving woman but a fighter who understood how to pick her battles. A slow smile spread across his face. "You are something else, Laura Sinclair." She smiled back, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the expression reached her eyes. "I learned from the best. Thomas always said you catch more flies with honey than vinegar." With the immediate crisis resolved, Pierce expected his involvement in Laura's life to diminish. He had done what he set out to do, helped her get the compensation she deserved. But he found himself reluctant to step back, inventing reasons to stop by her house. He fixed her fence, which was leaning precariously. He helped her carry supplies from the mercantile. He even accompanied her to church on Sunday, sitting beside her in the pew and feeling the curious eyes of the congregation on them. Laura, for her part, was experiencing a confusing tangle of emotions. She still grieved Thomas deeply, still woke in the night reaching for him only to find empty space beside her. But she also found herself looking forward to Pierce's visits, found herself thinking about the way he smiled and the gentle strength in his hands. She felt guilty about these feelings, worried that she was dishonoring Thomas's memory by being attracted to another man so soon after his death. One evening, she worked up the courage to visit Thomas's grave, something she had been avoiding since the funeral. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking Pecos, a peaceful spot shaded by mesquite trees. She knelt beside the simple wooden marker that bore her husband's name and let the tears come. "I do not know what to do," she whispered to the stone. "I miss you so much it feels like I cannot breathe sometimes. But there is this man, and he is kind and good, and when I am with him I feel like maybe I can survive this after all. I do not want to forget you, Thomas. I could never forget you." The wind rustled through the mesquite branches, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Laura sat there for a long time, remembering the boy she had loved and the man he had become. She thought about their dreams and their struggles and all the moments of joy they had shared. And slowly, she began to understand that loving Pierce would not erase what she had with Thomas. The heart was capable of holding multiple truths at once: grief and hope, loss and new beginnings, the memory of one love and the possibility of another. When she finally stood to leave, she felt lighter somehow, as if Thomas had given her permission to live again. Pierce was waiting for her at the cemetery gates. He had followed her at a distance, wanting to make sure she was safe but not wanting to intrude on her private moment. When Laura saw him, she walked straight to him and without saying a word, wrapped her arms around him. Pierce held her carefully as if she were made of something precious and fragile. "I think I am ready to stop just surviving," Laura said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I think I am ready to start living again." Pierce pulled back just enough to look down at her face. "What does that mean?" Laura took a breath, gathering her courage. "It means that I care about you, Pierce Abbott. It means that when you are around, the world feels less heavy. I know it has only been a few weeks since Thomas died and people will talk, but I cannot keep pretending that I do not feel something for you." Pierce's heart pounded in his chest. He had been so careful not to push, not to take advantage of Laura's vulnerability. But hearing her say these words, seeing the truth of them in her eyes, made him realize that what he felt for her went far deeper than sympathy or protectiveness. "I care about you too," he admitted. "I have cared about you since before I even spoke to you. I know the timing is complicated and I do not want to rush you into anything, but Laura, you have become the best part of my days." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Then let us take this slow, one day at a time. Let us see where it goes." Pierce turned his head and kissed her palm, a gesture so tender it made Laura's breath catch. "One day at a time," he agreed. Over the following months, Pierce and Laura built something careful and intentional. He courted her properly, bringing her flowers from the countryside and taking her on walks along the Pecos River. They talked about everything, their childhoods and their dreams, their fears and their hopes for the future. Laura told him about Thomas, keeping her husband's memory alive by sharing stories of their time together. Pierce listened without jealousy, understanding that Laura's ability to love him was connected to how deeply she had loved before. The townspeople did talk, as Laura had predicted. Some thought it was inappropriate for a widow to be seen with another man so soon after her husband's death. Others were more understanding, recognizing that Laura was young and alone and had no obligation to spend the rest of her life in mourning. Pierce endured the whispers and occasional harsh words with patience, always respectful of Laura's reputation and careful not to do anything that might bring her shame. By December, 6 months after Thomas's death, Pierce knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Laura. But he also knew he needed to approach this carefully. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, he broached the subject that had been on his mind. "I have been saving money for a long time," he said. "I have enough now to buy a piece of land and start my own ranch. Nothing fancy, but enough to run cattle and maybe horses. I have been looking at a property about 10 miles from here, good water and grass." Laura turned to look at him, her heart beginning to race. "That sounds wonderful, Pierce." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. "It would be more wonderful if I had someone to share it with. Laura, I know we have not been together long by conventional standards, but I know my own heart. I love you. I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Laura felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy this time. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Not yet," Pierce said gently. "I am asking if that is something you might want someday. I do not want to pressure you or make you feel like you have to rush into anything. But I need you to know what my intentions are, what I am working toward." Laura leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling safe and cherished. "I love you too, Pierce. I did not think I could feel this way again, but you have shown me that the heart has an infinite capacity for love." "Yes, that is something I want. When the time is right, yes." Pierce wrapped his arm around her and kissed the top of her head. They sat like that as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink. The time came sooner than either of them expected. In January of 1883, nearly 7 months after Thomas's death, the mine had another accident. This time it was a fire caused by a gas pocket ignition, and 3 men died before the flames could be controlled. The widows of those men came to Laura, having heard about her fight with Hartford. They wanted to know what they should do, how they could get the company to treat them fairly. Laura sat with these women in her small parlor, listening to their stories and their fears. She thought about how lost she had been in those early days, how Pierce's intervention had changed everything. And she realized that she had both the knowledge and the resources to help others in ways she had not been able to help herself. "We need to go to Hartford together," she told them. "Not just you three, but every widow from every accident this mine has ever had. We need to show him that this is not going away, that women deserve to be recognized and compensated for their losses." Pierce helped Laura organize the effort, tracking down former widows who had been denied compensation over the past 5 years. There were 12 in total, and on a cold February morning they marched together to the Silver Ridge mine office. This time, Laura was not pleading or begging. She stood at the front of the group with her shoulders back and her head high, demanding to see Charles Hartford. When he emerged, clearly annoyed at this disruption, he found himself facing not one grieving woman but a dozen determined ones, backed by a crowd of miners and townspeople who had come to show their support. "Mr. Hartford," Laura said, her voice carrying across the crowd, "these women have lost their husbands to your mine. They are owed compensation, just as I was owed compensation. You cannot continue to deny them based on their gender. It is immoral and it is wrong." Hartford's face reddened with anger. "Mrs. Sinclair, you signed an agreement not to discuss your settlement or make further claims against this company." "I signed an agreement not to discuss the terms of my specific settlement," Laura replied. "I said nothing about advocating for others, and I am making no claims on my own behalf. I am simply standing with these women and asking you to do the decent thing." Patterson stepped forward from the crowd. "Mr. Hartford, I have been researching mining law extensively since Mrs. Sinclair's case. There are precedents in California and Nevada for compensating widows. The territorial government is beginning to look at regulations for mining companies. If you continue to refuse compensation to these women, you may find yourself facing legal challenges that will cost far more than simply paying what is owed." Hartford looked at the faces staring back at him, understanding that he was cornered. If he refused, this story would spread beyond Pico's. Newspapers would pick it up and his reputation would suffer. The mine might face strikes or government intervention. It was a fight he could not win. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "I will review each case individually and determine appropriate compensation. But this ends today. I will not have my business held hostage by public sentiment." Laura smiled, and there was steel beneath it. "That is all we are asking, Mr. Hartford. Fair and appropriate compensation for these women's losses." As the crowd dispersed, several of the widows hugged Laura, thanking her through tears. Pierce stood back and watched, his chest swelling with pride. This woman he loved was not just surviving her grief. She was transforming it into something powerful and meaningful, creating change that would help others long after her own wounds had healed. That evening, Pierce came to Laura's house with purpose in his stride. He found her in the kitchen, still buzzing with the energy of the day's victory. Without preamble, he dropped to one knee and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "Laura Sinclair," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have watched you take your pain and turn it into power. I have watched you fight for justice not just for yourself, but for women you barely knew. You are the strongest, most compassionate person I have ever met, and I would be honored to spend the rest of my life standing beside you. Will you marry me?" Laura looked down at this man who had changed her life in every possible way, this man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Pierce, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band with a small diamond, and stood to gather her in his arms. They kissed with the passion of two people who had earned their happiness through struggle and perseverance, who understood that love was not just a feeling but a choice made every day. They were married in April of 1883, a year after Thomas's death, in a small ceremony at the church in Pecos. Laura wore a dress of pale blue rather than white, a nod to the fact that this was a second marriage for her. Pierce wore his best suit and could not stop smiling as he watched her walk down the aisle. Some of the townspeople still disapproved of how quickly Laura had moved on, but most were happy to see her finding joy again after so much sorrow. After the wedding, they moved to the property Pierce had purchased, 160 acres of good Texas land with a creek running through it, and enough grass to support a small herd of cattle. Pierce had built a modest house, nothing grand but sturdy and comfortable, with a porch that faced west so they could watch the sunsets together. Laura discovered that she loved ranch life. She took to caring for the cattle and horses with enthusiasm, learning from Pierce and proving to be a quick study. She also continued her advocacy work, corresponding with women in other mining towns and sharing information about how to fight for compensation and better working conditions. She became known throughout West Texas as someone who would stand up for those who had no voice. In the spring of 1884, Laura gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas Pierce Abbott, honoring both the husband she had lost and the husband who had helped her find herself again. Pierce held his son with tears streaming down his face, overcome by the magnitude of this moment. Laura watched them together, her heart full to bursting. "You think he would approve?" she asked softly, and Pierce knew she meant Thomas Sinclair. "I think he would want you to be happy," Pierce replied. "And I think he would approve of the fact that you never forgot him, even as you moved forward." Their life was not without struggles. The ranch demanded constant work, and there were years when drought threatened their livelihood. Laura suffered 2 miscarriages between 1884 and 1886, and the losses hit her hard, reminding her of all the grief she had carried. But Pierce was steady and patient, holding her through the dark times and celebrating with her during the good ones. In 1887, Laura gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, and in 1889, another son they called Daniel. Their home filled with the chaos and joy of children, with laughter echoing off the walls and small feet running across the floors. Young Thomas grew into a thoughtful boy who loved horses, while Rose was fierce and independent, already showing signs of her mother's determination. Daniel was the peacemaker, always trying to keep his siblings from fighting. As the years passed, the compensation fight that Laura had started in Pecos spread to other mining towns. Women began organizing, demanding better treatment and recognition of their rights. By 1890, the territorial government had passed laws requiring mining companies to provide compensation to widows, establishing funds and oversight to ensure the money reached those who needed it. Laura's name was mentioned in the newspapers, and she received letters from women across Texas and beyond, thanking her for her courage. Pierce watched his wife become a symbol of resilience and change, and he loved her more with each passing year. She had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and alchemized it into something that helped countless others. She never forgot Thomas Sinclair, keeping his photograph on the mantle and telling their children about the good man who had been her first husband. But she had also built a new life, full and rich and meaningful, with Pierce beside her. In 1895, 13 years after they first met, Pierce and Laura sat on their porch watching the sunset just as they had done so many times before. Their children were inside, supposedly doing homework but more likely causing mischief. The ranch had prospered, and they now ran 200 head of cattle and bred horses that were sought after throughout the region. "You ever regret it?" Pierce asked, reaching for Laura's hand. "Walking away from an easier life to throw your lot in with a cowboy," Laura laughed, the sound rich and warm. "An easier life? Pierce Abbott, you must have a different definition of easy than I do. This life is hard work from sunup to sundown." "You know what I mean," Pierce said, smiling. Laura turned to look at him, this man who had seen her broken and helped her become whole again. His hair was starting to gray at the temples now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to her, he was as handsome as the day he had appeared outside her house offering help. "I do not regret a single moment," she said firmly. "You saved my life, Pierce, in every way a person can be saved. You gave me back my hope and showed me that love does not have a limit. Every good thing in my life now exists because you had the courage to stand up for a stranger." Pierce lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You did the hard part. I just gave you a little push." "It was more than a little push," Laura insisted. "It was everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky blazed with color, the Texas landscape stretching out before them in all its harsh beauty. Inside the house, they heard Thomas calling for his father to settle an argument between him and Rose, heard Daniel trying to mediate as always. This was their life, built from ashes and grief, from determination and love. "I should go referee before those two kill each other," Pierce said, but he did not move immediately. "Give them another minute," Laura said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Let me just sit here with you a little longer." So they stayed, watching the sunset and holding hands, two people who had found each other in the darkest of times and built something extraordinary together. The mine that had taken Thomas Sinclair's life had also, in its cruelty, brought Pierce and Laura together. They never forgot that, never took for granted the strange twists of fate that had led them to this porch, this life, this love. As the sun finally disappeared below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Pierce and Laura stood and walked inside together, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Behind them, the last light faded from the sky, and the land settled into its evening quiet, witness to yet another day in a love story that had begun with tragedy and transformed into triumph. Their story became legend in Pecos, told and retold in the years that followed. People spoke of the widow who had stood up to the mine owner and the cowboy who had made sure justice was done. They spoke of the love that had grown from grief and the family that had flourished against all odds. And long after Pierce and Laura were gone, the laws they had helped change remained, protecting widows and families throughout Texas and beyond. But in those quiet evenings on the porch, as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and the children played inside, Pierce and Laura did not think about legacy or legend. They thought only about each other, about the life they had built together, and about the profound truth that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected ways. Years continued to unfold with a gentle rhythm that felt both earned and precious. Thomas grew tall and strong, eventually taking over much of the ranch work from Pierce, whose back was not as young as it used to be. Rose, true to her nature, refused several marriage proposals from local ranchers' sons, declaring that she would only marry when she found someone who saw her as an equal partner, not a decorative wife. Daniel went to Austin to study law, inspired by his mother's advocacy work, and determined to fight for people who could not fight for themselves. In 1902, 20 years after that fateful summer when Pierce had first approached Laura on her porch, the Silver Ridge mine finally closed. The silver had run out, and the company packed up and left Pecos, leaving behind empty buildings and a scarred landscape. Laura stood at the edge of the abandoned mine site with Pierce beside her, thinking about all the lives that had been lost in the pursuit of silver, including Thomas's. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked. "All those men who died, all those families who suffered. What did it accomplish in the end?" Pierce considered the question carefully. "The silver is gone, but the community that formed here remains. The people who came here looking for opportunity, they stayed and built lives. The laws that were changed because of you, they are still protecting families. Maybe that is the real legacy, not the mine itself, but what came from it." Laura nodded slowly. "I like to think that Thomas's death meant something, that because he died, others were saved in a way." "It meant everything," Pierce assured her. "Because of what happened to him, and because of your refusal to accept injustice. Hundreds of widows have been compensated over these past 20 years. That is a legacy worth having." They walked back to their wagon hand in hand, leaving the ghost town of the mine behind them. Pecos itself had changed over the years, growing and evolving. The railroad had come through in 1881, bringing more commerce and more people. The town now had a proper school, several churches, and a hospital. It was no longer the rough frontier outpost it had been when Laura and Thomas first arrived. In 1905, Rose finally married, though not to a rancher. She fell in love with a telegraph operator named Henry, who shared her passion for social justice and treated her with the respect she demanded. The wedding was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from the trees. Pierce walked Rose down the makeshift aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the tiny baby girl who had become this formidable woman. "Take care of her," he whispered to Henry during the ceremony, "or answer to me." Henry smiled, understanding the love and protectiveness behind the words. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of her, sir." Thomas married a year later, to a woman named Sarah who had grown up on a neighboring ranch. She fit into the Abbott family seamlessly, sharing Laura's practicality and Pierce's quiet strength. The young couple built a house on the far edge of the Abbott property, planning to expand the ranch and carry it into the next generation. Daniel remained in Austin, working for a law firm that specialized in labor rights. He visited when he could, bringing stories of the cases he was handling and the changes happening throughout Texas. He told his mother that she was still remembered, that her name came up in legal discussions about workers' rights and compensation laws. "You started something important, Ma," he said during one visit. "People talk about the Pecos Widows' March like it was a turning point." Laura felt a swell of pride, but also a sense of completeness. The fight that had begun in her darkest hour had rippled outward, creating change she never could have imagined. And through it all, Pierce had been there, steady and sure, the foundation upon which she had rebuilt her life. In 1908, Pierce and Laura celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from across the county. The yard filled with people, music, and laughter. As evening fell and the dancing began, Pierce led Laura away from the crowd to their familiar spot on the porch. 25 years, he marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you walk out of that mine office looking so defeated. Other times, it feels like I have known you my entire life. I was defeated that day, Laura admitted. I thought I had lost everything and there was no hope left. And then you appeared, this stranger who decided my fight was worth joining. Pierce pulled her close, swaying gently to the music drifting from the yard. Best decision I ever made, getting involved in your business. Laura laughed, resting her head against his chest. You were pretty stubborn about it, as I recall, would not take no for an answer. I recognized something in you, Pierce said. Even through all that grief and fear, I could see your strength. I knew that if someone just gave you a hand up, you would do extraordinary things." "We did extraordinary things together," Laura corrected. "I could not have fought that battle alone." They danced in the twilight, surrounded by the sounds of their family and the land they had built together. Rose was laughing at something Thomas said, while Sarah chased after their 2-year-old grandson, who was running through the crowd with wild abandon. Daniel was deep in conversation with Henry about some political matter, both men gesturing animatedly. "This is what I dreamed of," Pierce said softly. "All those years ago, working from ranch to ranch with no place to call home, I dreamed of having land and family and someone to share it all with." "You gave me that, Laura. You gave it to me too," she replied. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days alone, just surviving. You showed me that there could be new dreams, new beginnings." As the party continued into the night, Pierce and Laura eventually rejoined their family, accepting congratulations and well wishes from friends who had watched their love story unfold over the decades. Old Jacob from the mine was there, retired now but still sharp as ever. He raised a glass in toast. "To Pierce and Laura Abbott," he declared, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Two people who proved that doing the right thing matters and that love can bloom even in the hardest soil." Everyone cheered and drank, and Laura felt Pierce's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently. She squeezed back, a silent conversation that needed no words. The years that followed were gentler, as if the universe had decided they had earned some peace. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas and Sarah's management. Rose and Henry moved to San Antonio, where Rose became involved in the women's suffrage movement, using the lessons she had learned from her mother about organizing and fighting for justice. Daniel was appointed as a territorial judge, a position from which he could effect real change in the legal system. Pierce and Laura slowed down, as bodies inevitably do. They spent more time on the porch and less time in the saddle, content to watch the world they had built continue without their constant involvement. They became grandparents several times over, their house filling on holidays and special occasions with children and grandchildren who carried forward the values they had instilled. In the winter of 1910, Pierce fell ill with pneumonia. Laura nursed him through it with fierce determination, refusing to let him surrender to the sickness. She sat by his bed day and night, talking to him about their memories, their children, their life together. And slowly he recovered, though he never regained all his strength. "You are not allowed to leave me yet," Laura told him when he was finally well enough to sit up. "We still have too much living to do." Pierce smiled weakly. "I would not dare disobey you, Mrs. Abbott. You are far too formidable." But the illness had shaken them both, a reminder that their time was finite. They began to take stock of their lives, to make sure that everything was in order for their children. Pierce wrote letters to each of them, expressing his pride and his love. Laura compiled all her notes and correspondence about the compensation fight, creating a record that Daniel could use in his legal work. "I want what we did to matter," she told Pierce one evening. "I want people to remember that ordinary people can create change if they are willing to stand up." "It will matter," Pierce assured her. "Our children will make sure of it, and their children after them." In 1912, 30 years after they first met, Pierce and Laura took a trip to Missouri, visiting the town where Laura had grown up. They stood at the graves of her parents and Thomas's parents, paying respects to people who had shaped the woman Laura had become. She told them about her life, about the children and grandchildren, about the ranch in Texas, and the man who had saved her. "I think they would approve," Pierce said as they walked back through the cemetery. "I hope so," Laura replied. "I hope Thomas approves too. I have tried to honor his memory while also building a new life. It has not always been easy to balance those things." Pierce stopped walking and turned to face her. "Laura, look at me. You have lived with honor and courage every single day since I have known you. You have loved deeply and fought fiercely and created something beautiful from tragedy. If Thomas Sinclair could see you now, he would be proud beyond measure. And he would be grateful that I was there to make sure you were taken care of." Laura kissed him then, there in the Missouri cemetery, a kiss that held 3 decades of love and partnership and unwavering devotion. They returned to Texas renewed, as if visiting the past had somehow freed them to fully embrace their future, however long it might be. The ranch welcomed them back with the familiar sense of sage and cattle, with the wide, open sky that seemed to stretch forever. Home, Laura thought. This is home in every way that matters. The years continued their march. 1913 brought a drought that tested the ranch's resources but did not break them. 1914 saw Rose giving birth to her 4th child, a girl they named Laura in honor of her grandmother. 1915 brought Daniel's appointment to the state Supreme Court, a moment of immense pride for the entire family. Through it all, Pierce and Laura remained each other's constant. They still sat on the porch most evenings, still held hands as they watched the sunset. Their conversations ranged from the profound to the mundane, from discussions about the changing world to debates about whether Rose's children were being raised too permissively. "We are old," Pierce observed one evening, looking at his weathered hands. "We are seasoned," Laura corrected with a smile, "like good leather or fine wine." "I am serious, Laura. We have lived a good long while, and I find myself thinking about what comes after." Laura was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we get to rest. I think we get to watch over our family from wherever we end up. And I think we get to be together, because I cannot imagine any version of heaven that does not include you." Pierce's eyes grew moist. "That is all I want. More time with you, however much we are given." "Then that is what we will have," Laura said with conviction. "We have defied the odds before, Pierce Abbott. We can do it again." And somehow they did. Years passed, bringing with them both joy and sorrow. They lost friends to age and illness, attended funerals for people who had been part of their journey. But they also celebrated weddings and births, watched their family tree grow and branch out across Texas and beyond. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. Rose sent a telegram from San Antonio that simply read, "We did it, Ma. Women have a voice now." Laura read it with tears streaming down her face, thinking about all the widows who had stood with her 38 years earlier, demanding to be heard and recognized. This was the natural extension of that fight, the expansion of rights and recognition that had begun with the simple assertion that women mattered. Pierce found her crying on the porch and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Good tears or sad tears? Grateful tears," Laura replied. "I am grateful that I lived long enough to see this. Grateful that Rose will live in a world where her voice counts. Grateful for all of it, Pierce. Every single moment." He sat beside her, their bodies fitting together with the ease of decades of practice. "I am grateful too. For you, for our family, for this life we built from scratch." As the 1920s unfolded, bringing modernity and change to even remote corners of Texas, Pierce and Laura found themselves serving as the keepers of history for their family. Grandchildren would visit and ask them to tell stories about the old days, about what Pecos was like before electricity and automobiles, about the mine and the fight for compensation. Laura never tired of telling those stories, always making sure to include Thomas Sinclair, to honor the man whose death had inadvertently brought her and Pierce together. She wanted her grandchildren to understand that life was complicated, that love could come in multiple forms, that honoring the past did not mean you could not embrace the future. In the summer of 1925, Pierce and Laura celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary. They were both in their 70s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and spirit. The family gathered again at the ranch, now including great-grandchildren who ran through the yard with the same wild energy that Thomas, Rose, and Daniel had possessed decades earlier. Pierce watched the chaos with contentment, his arm around Laura's waist. "We made something good here," he said. "We did," Laura agreed. "Against all odds, we made something beautiful." That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Pierce and Laura sat on their porch one last time. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air warm and still. They did not talk much, content simply to be together as they had been for more than 4 decades. "I love you," Pierce said finally, the words no less powerful for how often they had been spoken. "I love you too," Laura replied. "Thank you for saving me all those years ago." "You saved me right back," Pierce said. "We saved each other." Pierce Abbott passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, his heart simply deciding it had beaten long enough. Laura was beside him when it happened, holding his hand and knowing somehow that this was goodbye even before she felt his fingers go slack. She sat with him for a long time, memorizing his face, saying all the things she needed to say. The funeral brought people from across Texas, former miners and their families, judges and lawyers who had worked with Daniel, suffragettes who had fought alongside Rose, ranchers who had done business with Thomas. They all came to pay respects to a man who had lived with quiet integrity, who had stood up for a widow when no one else would, and who had built a life defined by love and justice. Laura stood at the graveside with her children beside her, watching as Pierce was laid to rest on a hill overlooking the ranch. She did not cry, not then. She had done her crying in private, in those first raw hours after his death. Now she stood straight and strong, honoring him with her strength just as he had always honored hers. In the days that followed, Laura found herself thinking about the long arc of her life. She had loved 2 good men, lost them both to death's inevitable claim. She had fought battles and raised children and helped change laws. She had built a home and a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. And through it all, she had learned that the human heart was capable of remarkable things, of surviving profound loss and still finding reasons to hope. She lived for 3 more years, staying on the ranch that she and Pierce had built, surrounded by family and memories. She remained sharp and engaged, still writing letters to politicians and activists, still fighting for causes she believed in. And every evening she sat on that porch and watched the sunset, feeling Pierce's presence beside her like a comforting warmth. On a spring morning in 1928, Laura Sinclair Abbott passed away in her sleep, her heart finally at rest. She was 70 years old, and she had lived fully and fearlessly. Her children found her looking peaceful, a slight smile on her face, as if she had seen something wonderful in those final moments. They buried her beside Pierce, as she had requested. The marker they placed bore both their names and a simple inscription. They stood for justice and loved without limit. And so the story that had begun with tragedy and loss, with a mine owner's cruelty and a cowboy's compassion, ended with peace and completion. The ranch continued under Thomas and Sarah's care, passed down eventually to their children and grandchildren. Rose's daughters became lawyers and activists, carrying forward Laura's legacy of fighting for women's rights. Daniel's legal reforms helped protect workers and widows for generations. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest one. The proof that love could bloom even in the hardest times, that two people who met in grief could build joy together, and that standing up for what was right mattered even when the odds seemed impossible. Pierce and Laura's story became part of the fabric of Pecos, Texas, a reminder that ordinary people could create extraordinary change, and that the measure of a life well lived was not in wealth or fame but in love given and justice served. The sun continued to set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in brilliant colors, just as it had for all those years when Pierce and Laura sat together watching. And if sometimes the wind carried the sound of laughter from the porch of the old Abbott Ranch house, well, perhaps that was just the land remembering the love it had witnessed, the battles it had seen, and the triumph of two hearts that had refused to surrender to despair.